Recording. Start the recording. So,
great.
Hey everybody out there in the Blab universe and the universe more generally. Thanks for joining us. My name is Thomas Lain, and we have the honor of being joined by the prolific, along various trajectories, Doug Lain. And well, I suppose the real point of departure will be his his recent book, After the Saucers Landed. Is that your most recent book, or did you have something else forthcoming there?
You know, I have books coming out, or I have a book that's still scheduled to come out from Zero Books, but as far as published books, this is my most recent. It came out in August.
And it's been well received, and my understanding is that it was actually nominated. It's been nominated for the Hugo Award.
No, not the Hugo. No, not the Hugo.
I'm sorry.
The Philip K. Dick Award.
Well, all right. So, and it's ostensibly a fictional novel that sort of pushes the edge of the genre. But why don't you go ahead and set it up? Give us a little gloss for the listeners here.
Okay, it's a story of what happens to a ufologist and his co-writer or ghostwriter after the saucers land. It's called After the Saucers Landed, and the ufologist I chose to write about and is also a Fluxus artist. So in the book, I get to write about the history of avant-garde art, especially in the 20th century, as well as speculate about identity and some philosophical ideas and problems with identity, as well as have fun playing with the UFO trope and writing about the contactee experience quite a bit. So
there's lots of threads coming together in the novel, and one of which, just to sort of focus on the notion of the saucers landing to begin. You have the idea that the aliens, the Pleiadians, arrive, and they land in the early 80s. Is that correct?
In the early 90s.
Early 90s, sorry. And the event proves anticlimactic for the central protagonist.
Yeah, I would say deflationary, even.
Deflationary, because we have this anticipation that the extraterrestrial intervention is going to transform the complexion of our world in various ways. And I mean, even just thinking about it in terms of the world in which we're inhabiting, a lot of times you have the idea that if something like that were to happen, it could cascade into a unification of humanity on the more positive side. And then you also have other more dour assessments about the subjugation of humanity or what have you. So, but in any event, the notion is that the world, for better or for worse, would undergo a qualitative shift in terms of how it's constructed, in terms of how we experience it. But that isn't really what happens after the saucers landed. Would you say that is fair?
It starts to happen, but it's by the end of the book, maybe we realize that it has happened more than we know. But at the beginning of the book, the saucer people, the Pleiadians, seem to be just another nonprofit group, really, another church to join in a otherwise mundane world, modern world, much like ours, only 20 years ago or more.
So, and I've not quite finished the book. I'm on page 150 something.
Yeah.
But my impression is that the appeal of the aliens is actually somewhat mystifying to me. Like, it's not really, it is really clear what the attraction is, why people are drawn to sort of join them, especially because when you read the book, the way they present themselves is almost kitschy. They rely on tropes and even kinds of technology which are obviously antiquated, even from the standpoint of the early '90s. And there's some speculation that on the part of the ufologist that the reason they use this is because they're trying to resonate in a way with a nostalgia that people experience. But despite that speculation, when you look at how you describe conversion encounters where people allow themselves to be assumed up into the alien craft, it seems like there's something sort of deeper happening there, which ties into the question of identity. So why don't you describe how you in the book present the notion of being converted, if you like, or being assumed, or joining the Pleiadians in their world, in their universe?
I think secretly, I kind of believe that what's happening to the people who, in the book, allow themselves to transcend with the flying saucer people, with the Pleiadians, and what they do is a UFO or a flying saucer will kind of land in a metropolitan area and send out a signal of some kind. Often it will follow this or that car or person and sort of signal that it is time for a surrender. Then they'll land, and groups of would-be acolytes, would-be followers, or people who are trying to transition into that will gather around, stripped naked, and then be transported into the craft and then taken, it's assumed, to the home world of the aliens. I kind of secretly felt that these people were being destroyed in some way or another, that they were not necessarily coming to a good end, but it wasn't so much that I thought that the aliens were like eating them or something so mundane as that, but just that what was happening is that they were leaving the story of human history. And to be really direct and sort of simple about it, they were leaving the novel. They were not going to be heard from again. They were no longer going to be represented. So one of the points of the book is that we seek this authenticity, this pure experience, this unmediated experience, and that the truth about that, what that would be like, is in the end, it would be just a negation. It would just be an elimination, that the only kind of experience that we have on offer, that's possible, that we can experience is always going to be mediated. It's always going to be partially removed.
So, and I mean, that really cuts to the chase, because I'm just letting that sit, and I think it relates to perhaps back to why Harold,
mm-hmm. And Brian is the narrator. Harold is
right.
The
relationship between them isn't as straightforward as one might anticipate in the opening goings. But leaving that aside for the moment, he, pretty much from the get-go, even before it becomes evident that what processes will be sort of set into play for people to surrender, to go over to the Pleiadian world, he has sort of written it off. And I think it connects precisely to the fact that the endpoint experience, the idea of the unmediated experience which they are offering to the people of Earth, sort of destroys other possibilities. Like you said, they're not just leaving the novel. What you're having is a negation of experience in history, engagement in this world and with each other. Is this what drives the disillusionment of Harold?
Well, I think at the
really see it in that conspicuous way.
I mean, I think at the beginning of the novel, what drives it is the opposite. He's disenchanted because they've appeared, not as abstract promise, but as real physical beings, just as they've kind of always been thought of. They showed up. So, right out of the literature, right out of the UFO literature. So when they're actually in the world, they're kitschy, they're phony, they're laughable. And the book is supposed to be funny, but so that's what bothers him at first. It's just that when you have a transcendent notion and it becomes actualized, it loses something in becoming sensuous. It loses something in becoming actual. It can never quite fit into the world in any way that's other than in a deflationary way. And so that's the first problem. And then the promise of the religion that's founded is another problem. But we should talk about the fact that the Pleiadians seem to help humans lose their identity.
Yeah, so why don't you go ahead and talk about that?
Okay, a Pleiadian might show up at, say, your cocktail party or your house party, and you invited him, and you might decide about 5-10 minutes in, or however long, that he doesn't think that you should be the host anymore, but that one of the other partiers, one of the other people at the party, maybe you're the president of a university and you've invited him, and one of the new professors, a young man from the math department, is just seemingly a better choice to be the president of the university. So what the Pleiadian might do is just get you two to change roles. And in the process of this, the older university president will take on the personality of the young professor, and vice versa, and everyone around will accept this. The Pleiadians have this power to get people to change their social position, change their personality, change who they think they are, and
the Pleiadians.
And the reason why that is the case is because, in actual fact, in the novel, there's no material basis for people that they are, in fact, these accumulations of descriptions and social positions and ideas, and that there's nothing grounding them really. So it's easy enough to switch people around, and yet there still seems to be something that does ground the text. And so I tried to explore what that might be.
I mean, what comes to my mind is the corporeality, right? Our relationship with our physical body, and the significance of that is negated if, in fact, because if you take the body out of the equation, then you do get this circumstance where, we're almost like role play game characters, right? With sheets that, have randomly attributed skill sets and histories, but ultimately it's altogether fictional. And if it's fictional, then there's nothing that ties together the terms of that fiction with organic necessity, and hence this interchangeability. Okay.
Yeah.
So the negation of the body, to me, plays a significant role in how does that connect with our current circumstance, just to step outside of the novel for just a moment, in terms of the condition of contemporary politics. I mean, I guess that it almost seems it would have been more urgent, more obviously urgent in like the 80s and the early 90s, when identity politics were really sort of at their height. But that's not to say that the issue has been resolved and gone.
No, I think it's very much even more significant today than it was then. Identity politics, but the way I recently created a little podcast. Rather than talk about it politically, I'd rather talk about it in terms of philosophy.
Yeah, sure. Right on. Go for it.
So I recently created a podcast about the word problematic, and what it ended up being was a little bit of a sketch of the way modern epistemology has developed. So starting really with Kant, and I'm sort of cheating by starting there, but you could start a couple steps back with the empiricists and say the problem was that the relationship between the world of sensuous perception and the world of objective materiality was brought into question by people like George Berkeley and Locke and Hume and the empiricists, and that there have been different attempts to resolve that issue. Kant's being perhaps the most successful. I think Hegel's is as successful, trickier, more difficult, but as successful, possibly. And that what I say happened after Kant was that you got two schools of philosophy, those who on some level or another accepted Kant's rationality and his principles of sort of rationality as opposed to reason, and those who sought to reconnect to the sensuous world in a way that was irrational or that tried to go beyond reason, and basically who embraced Nietzsche as the person who could resolve the split or the problem of perception. And so go ahead.
I was just going to say that Kant is useful because he sort of creates the framework of the question. Yes, he's sort of anticipated. You can go back in the prehistory, look at the empiricists or the rationalists side by side. Someone like Husserl sort of actually situates that break as originating with Galileo and the Galilean mathematization of nature and so forth, right?
Yeah.
But we can just bracket that for the sake of the conversation and say, look, here's Kant, and he sets things up vis-a-vis what is known as the Copernican revolution in epistemology.
Right.
Where prior to Kant, the idea is that the truth of a statement is a function of its adequacy or the manner in which it conforms with the objective or exterior world. With Kant, you have the insight that, in fact, it's rather somewhat like the opposite, because our access to that objective or exterior world is, in fact, mediated. And one upshot of that mediation is that it seems, as a result, that the objective or exterior world itself is something of a hypothesis, because we don't have direct knowing access to it. We are tempted to suspect it does not even exist, and we're sort of like confronted with the horror of a solipsistic universe.
Right.
And so how do you respond to this terrifying possibility? And there are lines that follow thereafter. One of them sort of takes the position that one can have kind of faith in the order of the universe, which actually I think in a way was Kant's own view. He says, I think Kant almost in a kind of nuanced adaptation of the Pascalian bet, right? It's like, well, it has to be this way because it simply wouldn't make sense otherwise. I mean, the world just would not make sense if it didn't have a certain coherence. And what I'm saying, I'm not using Kant's words exactly, right, but I think that's the impression, the feel I get from him, right? And then there are others who are just willing to accept that it is crazy. And then how do you respond to that craziness, that sort of almost like void which arises? And you have then Nietzsche and people like Nietzsche who say, well, the task now is to create our own values in this desert upon which we have landed.
Right.
I also think sort of Camus has some interesting things to say about it vis-a-vis his conception of the absurd, because it grasps, I think, his conception of the absurd grasps that really not one or the other of these poles is acceptable. you need to come to a kind of conciliation. It's not the best word, but you know, all this sounds right. So what does identity? What does identity have to do with this complex of problems? Okay, which sort of have to do with whether the universe has a meaning apart from the meaning we inject into it. And do you feel that that connects with what you're trying to address after the saucers landed?
Yeah, I do. I think that I'm trying to work out narratively some of these issues around epistemology and politics, but a lot of what's in the book is about what we can know and what our access might be to some realm beyond human perception. And the aliens would be representatives of that realm and narratively in the book. And I've been, I've read the Phenomenology of Spirit. I kind of stand on having read it because I feel like for me anyway, it's kind of an accomplishment to have done that. And I'm still trying to work out what I think of it. I should read it again.
So yeah, I haven't actually read that book.
Yeah. I spent like 2 years reading it publicly.
Yeah, it's not exactly something you can just swallow in a weekend.
No.
So I'm excited by the fact that you're bringing it up because essentially you're tacitly, and maybe you can affirm or deny this, saying that in a way you're trying to take up the challenge of the phenomenology of spirit with after the saucers landed, albeit there's lots of things going on between A and B, but are you why if that's accurate?
Yeah.
Could you say, like, what are you getting explicitly out of the phenomenology of spirit as opposed to what you would get out of Kant? And then how does that connect with after the saucers landed?
Well, I just want to say, first off, that I don't expect readers of After the Saucers Landed, to quite understand what I'm saying in terms of phenomenology of spirit, nor would I say that the failure for them to understand is on them. I wouldn't expect people who have read the phenomenology of spirit to necessarily be able to track what the thinking is that's going on in After the Saucers Landed. So as a work of philosophy, I'm not sure that I would stand behind, 100% behind After Saucers Landed, because it is my own undisciplined, fictional working out through associations, loose associations, kind of lateral thinking, what my impressions are of not just that book, but the problem that we have after that book. So when one of the things I wrestle with as a novelist and someone who also has interest in philosophy is just where the boundary between philosophy and fiction is, and how didactic I can be as a novelist and how fictional I can be as a philosopher. So I just want to say all that sort of preemptively to hold my critics at bay. But then you asked, just how am I taking up I think you asked, just how is this book taking up the phenomenologies of spirit? Yeah. Is that right?
That's actually what I asked. You might preface that with sort of maybe get a gloss of what do you get out of the phenomenology of spirit itself, which sort of built on the questions we dealt with vis-a-vis Kant, and then go and connect that to what you're doing.
Well, I think kind of I'm a little simple-minded about what I got out of the phenomenology of spirit, and it's a book that's very complex and yet set up on a simple contradiction. So I tend not to get, as I think back on it, I tend not to get very far away from the beginning of that book, where he talks about sense certainty and the way that the senses, the way that the subject will perceive the world as immediate or unmediated, as an obvious presence, but that with reflection will not only lose that sense of immediacy, but will lose the object, because it will become obvious that that what he's perceiving isn't something in itself apart from him, but is a product or a representation or an image within his own perception, within himself. And so that's the problem restated of the problem of perception. What Hegel does is point out that even the sense of self that he has is also an object to him. That when he considers that fact of the loss of the primacy of the object, let's say he's looking at an apple and he realizes that apple is not something that he's understanding in itself apart from him, but is only an image in his mind. He can then see that image in his mind is something that he takes to be apart from him, that it isn't the same as him. Even his understanding of that problem is not identical with him. And so just as he loses the object, he loses himself. So what Hegel points out is that neither the thinking subject nor the objects of perception have any independent existence outside of that relation. And that the truth of the subject, the truth of reality, has to do with that relation, which introduces a kind of a third position. But it's one that isn't easily resolved because it's one that's set up on a contradiction, and it's very counterintuitive. But so that's something that I'm exploring throughout the book, and I'll stop there.
So, I was just going to try and make.
I'll stop at the limits of my understanding, really. But anyway, go on.
Well, I was insofar as suggesting a possible analog. Oh, it just came to me, and I haven't thought through it all. But would you say that maybe, there's the two terms? There's the object, and then there's the self, but neither have an innate autonomy. Their truth arises from their relation. If I'm hearing you correctly.
Yeah.
And then is there possibly an analogous between those two terms? Say like a concern with the truth of the subject and the narrator, and the truth of the object with Harold?
Yeah. Okay, so here, let me see if I can. First of all,
and then there's also the question of his wife or wives, and is the role of the feminine being posited is playing in there, or is that just coming out of left field? So
no, that's in there. Yes, that's in there. The feminine has been related to the object for a lot of Western philosophy, and through a lot of the history of Western philosophy. Can you mute yourself because there's a lot of noise there? So yeah, the feminine has been related to what's objective or with the object in a lot of throughout history, and because the feminine has been related to nature, and nature is what's present before the thinking subject comes along. So yeah, that's in there, but it's just one way that the question arises about this relationship between the subject and the object, or between the thinking person and the world. And the point of being able to move the thinking subject around in the book, the alien's ability to do that, is to show that what the thinking subject is from this perspective is primarily negative. In other words, it doesn't, all the positive things you can say about, say, Harold, the ufologist Fluxus artist, can be taken away, and yet Harold, or more to the point, even his name's gone, but the thinking subject or the point of view or the perspective remains. And so that's one of the points of the book. and so I mean, again, the writing this, I'm just trying to think through what I'd read and was contemplating, and the reason why it's significant to me is because when it comes to identity politics, is because I see so much of the left's politics revolving around trying to find somebody with kind of positive moral authority, someone whose identity and subjectivity is not problematic. In other words, not self-contained, but, truly authentic. And I think that once you take that position of being the subject that is truly authentic, you actually stop being a subject at all, and you're trying to take on the position of the object, which means that you renounce your authority and power. You're only objective in so much as you don't seem to be interpreting. So, so I'll let you respond to that.
Well, I do think this is actually going back a little bit, but I think it's important, as you noted a little bit ago, to really seek out the philosophical as opposed to really the political ground. Because if you become fixated on the ground of political consideration merely, without bringing to bear the presuppositions, you get lost very quickly. Probably the most obvious way this becomes manifest is the way that sort of a dogmatism is so attractive. No matter where you are on the political spectrum, there's an attraction to an ideological rigidity. And I think that connects directly to this issue of identity and the need to found that identity. But as you move toward authenticity, I have to think more about what you said, because like my intuition coming into this conversation is that authenticity actually sort of can serve as an antidote toward the attraction of the ideological, because to be truly authentic is to be present to what's unfolding, which precludes the presumption of certitude. However, you've identified that is almost a slippery slope, where you can completely lose your mooring and become, as a consequence of this sort of openness, bereft of authority, because you're no longer sort of inserting or investing or committing yourself to the situation in a positive way. And I can see that as being, a real risk. It's almost saying that you have to find a point of a fixed point upon which you stake your claim. That you don't actually have the luxury of this almost mystical renunciation of a fixed position if you want to get something done. But we don't. But it's just like
there's a scene. There's a scene in my novel where the main character, the narrator, not Harold, but the narrator, decides he's going to have to go to the FBI to report what he's found out about the aliens. And the scene starts with him saying, I know why this move is wrong, because I've taught this, and I know that paranoid fiction has this quality to it, where the the protagonist is being paranoid and thinks that the world is undermined, at the same time has to believe in the authority and the legitimacy of the state or the authorities, whatever they may be. He has to believe in them in order for his paranoia to be expressed. So like in the Body Snatchers, Invasion of the Body Snatchers movie, the 1970s version with Donald Sutherland, he discovers that all the people, many people around him have been replaced by pod people. They're no longer authentic. They're just copies of themselves. And he's even had experiences where people in authority are clearly pod people. And his response is to call the police. And then, once he realizes this is really happening, he calls the police. And of course, he discovers that they've already infiltrated the police and that's of no use at all. But if he had been truly all the way to the end paranoid, he wouldn't have made that move. But at the same time, it's only through that move that he can truly enact his paranoia. So this relates to what you're saying. If you think that what's authentic is simply following the process in the moment of what is brought to you, what you'll find is that you will be accepting all the terms that you receive, that are already present without acting on them, without that you'll be led. It's easy enough to be led. And also it's easy enough to sort of to duck your responsibility. And so that's what happens to the character. He acts in such a way that he knows to be a mistake, and yet feels that it is his only recourse, that in fact, his hand is being moved. By the end of the book, I hope to have hinted that there's a possibility other than that.
Yes, the third way, as it were. Because,
right. Not to be Blairite about it, yeah.
So no, but I mean, it's actually like it's a very acute point you're making, and I personally have had lots of frustrations watching certain people on the left. It seems that sometimes they sort of retrench, and like one place you see this is like in the gun control debate, where there's this overwhelming concern about the need to regulate guns and government access and so forth, right? But you can't have your cake and eat it too, because by sort of focusing on the idea that guns should be regulated and that you should give this power to the state apparatus, it seems that you're giving away lots of other more fundamental commitments, or the idea that we should just go ahead and imprison all the Wall Street bankers. There's a contradiction there, right? Because
that's the very same people that on one day will say we should abolish all prisons, will the next day say we should throw all the Wall Street bankers in prison.
Precisely, right? To me, that's like a non-starter. I mean, I'm not. You have to sort of step outside of. You got to step off the railroad tracks. The railroad tracks go back and forth. The solution is all from the railroad tracks, and I mean, I don't necessarily have the so-called solution, right? And insofar as it's there, I really question whether it can even be articulated. Of course, I realize that by saying that, I'm inviting a charge of collaborating with a sort of subjectivism. But I feel like I have to take that risk.
Right. Well, I mean, this novel was somewhat a subjectivist book, right? I mean, it's all about the subject, and it's all. And the other thing to think about, going way back to sort of the abstract philosophy, is that Kant was that right now in both realms of philosophy, whether it's continental or analytic, there is no really good, solid materialist theory anymore. And I've heard Noam Chomsky say this recently, and it's in this podcast that I made called Your Fave is Problematic, that even amongst physicists and the most scientifically minded people, that there is no solid theory of solids or of a mechanical material universe any longer. And that for Chomsky, what is material is simply what we understand. I mean, it was an amazing thing for him to say in this sort of Q&A section after a lecture. Maybe you would want to back off that, the full implications of it. But I would say that we really do not have a official worldview which includes the material universe any longer. And
I mean, it's funny that you say that, because to me, by the way, when you
Yeah.
say like the materialist worldview, there's two different ways you can hear that. There's the old Marxian sense of the material theory, where when you're asserting materiality, you're not really, in my view, talking about physical stuff. You're really talking about engaging with the concrete, which is something strangely more elusive than just physicality.
Right.
And then there's the idea of just raw physicality, which is the sort of default position predominantly in analytic philosophy, where we want to get to a place where we can understand the universe as a complex physical system, full stop. But the problem which that invites is, well, what is this physical stuff? And whether you're coming at it from the question of whether consciousness can be reduced, or how do you deal with certain paradoxes that arise with like the observer phenomena vis-a-vis the double slit experiment and physics and so forth. You're coming up against a really weird space where you really don't know what matter is. And so, Chomsky is to be applauded for saying that. And Chomsky is a person himself who, he's very sympathetic with the positive sciences, the natural sciences.
Oh yeah.
The scientific method, as he said, he thinks is, very promising in terms of what resources it can grant us.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a gorilla in the corner there, and I think it's somewhat unfortunate that many resources which exist. I think that there are resources on the table to help us deal with that gorilla, but which aren't really being employed. Not that the problem's ever been solved per se, but I think there are elements of the tradition and history which have come closer to something like a solution than we seem to be experiencing at present. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. And I just say that when it comes to Marx, his materialism, as best as I understand it, is one which has to do with human activity. That for him, what we do and how we work together to create our own societies and world is the material basis of society. It's not. He doesn't look to something truly abstract, which is the material universe as it is apart from humanity, to explain the social world. He looks to our methods of production to explain the material basis of our world, and I think that's a Hegelian kind of move, because he's bringing human understanding into the world. He's basically saying, look, our human understanding, just like Chomsky did in a way, but slightly differently, our human understanding and our modes of understanding and modes of working together in production, that is the foundation for the material world. That said, the natural sciences and the physics and biology and all of those things, they inform our production, and they inform the way we interact with the world, and they improve the way we interact with the world. And it's not as though you can, because our human production, our human understanding shapes and founds the world, that doesn't mean that you can just ignore what the empirical sciences bring to the table and just will some sort of solutions to problems. It's a process of reasonable understanding and evaluation and interpretation, which is not the same thing at all as simply human will. And I think that's important to point out. Anyway,
it is important. So there's like an enormous space for, there's an enormous amount of logical space where we are putting ourselves in and adding interpretation. And And my anxiety that arises in conversations where the scientific narrative gets lots of cachet is that it's not really appreciated how much space there is. So a lot of weight, for instance, is given toward the neo-Darwinian synthesis and theory of evolution. And when you hear a lot of conversation about it, it's just sort of accepted as obviously the case. But it's not actually obviously the case. There are, serious challenges which encumber that theory. They don't have anything to do with theology, right? The fact is that it ultimately, and the biggest problem is the problem of teleology, because it's really hard to square the circle of the fact that the sort of theory of natural selection ultimately relies on a stochastic or random mechanism to suddenly produce systems of remarkable complexity and coherent order. Those two terms don't square up nicely in the least. Now, the way they try and make them square up is say, well, they've got a really, really, really long time. But that sort of actually amounts to saying that if you put so many chimpanzees in a room with typewriters, eventually you're going to get Hamlet. So there's something else going on, which the neo-Darwinian theory, in my view, just doesn't have the internal resources.
Well, Tom, let me ask you, do you think that's wrong? Do you think that if we could put an infinite number of chimps in rooms with typewriters that we'd find Hamlet somewhere in that mix? I mean, you don't think we would?
No.
Okay.
Now, I mean, I could answer that question in two different ways. Okay. The one is that, first of all, I just don't think it would happen because chance is amnesiac, right? So you have no guarantee of any outcome whatsoever. All right. So yes, there's a logical possibility. There's a possibility that you could arrive at that manuscript, but it's not necessitated. But how do I account for that possibility? Well, if that possibility arises, is that really Hamlet? And I'm actually going to say no, it's not actually Hamlet. Yes, the two manuscripts are isomorphic, but Hamlet, the manuscript, actually represents the outcome of an intentional formulation. And this actually, I'm going to say, changes the very being of what you are scrutinizing in a deep way. Now
this is, I mean, we've opened up a whole nother can of worms about, intentionality and free will and whether or not free will is even a coherent concept. I mean, I'm not sure that it is. I think that I can't help but operate like it is, but I'm not sure that it is, certainly Hamlet produced in some star chamber in outer space, looked over by aliens, by a chimp, by one of the infinite chimps. So I'm just trying to create a science fiction scenario where all these chimps would exist, and it would have to be some godlike aliens that had set up little star chambers like 2001 and put the chimps in there with the typewriters. So, certainly if a chimp were to write Hamlet, the significance of that Hamlet would be nothing because it would be a Hamlet for chimps, and chimps can't read Hamlet.
Yeah.
But that's not quite the same thing as saying that the intentionality of the chimp is what would create Hamlet's meaning. It's more the context, the whole social.
Yeah.
So, and in this case, Hamlet is, and the other thing the thing about it is Hamlet the reason why the monkeys and their typewriters have come up is we're asking the question, how is it the human culture, human life, and then one step down from that, all life ever came to be in a random process like chimps typing. And the answer is chance. The scientists tell us, and I'm not entirely sure that that's wrong. I mean, I think that I'd have to think it through a bit more. But that doesn't strike me as wrong. But the main thing about it is it's no social theory, because it doesn't tell us what to do. It just tells us what the conditions are that we find ourselves in at the start, like how we arose. But it's still up to us then, in this maybe Nietzschean way, to try to create values. And here's one thing that I thought recently, maybe this is way off to the side, but it did strike me. There's this idea in science fiction about harnessing the power of the sun, like creating, I think of it as it's some sort of shell around the sun, but I think of it as like gigantic sun-sized solar panels out there in space that surround the sun, and then we could control the energy coming out of the sun and use it for our own purposes. And I thought, that's a really neat idea, but aren't we more likely to go extinct if we do something like that? Because then human error becomes a factor, and maybe we'd be more efficient at using the sun's energy for a while, but aren't we just setting up a catastrophe on, at least the scale of a solar system if we do something like that? And then I thought, but wait a minute. The only reason the sun is this is all happening by chance at the moment. Isn't reason going to be a better approach than just leaving it to random, chaotic chance? Aren't we more likely to get a catastrophe if we do nothing rather than intervene? So I think that's one question that gets to the heart of, what is the responsibility of the subject in a big scale, kind of science fiction way.
Right. I mean, that's science fiction framing, but it actually tracks pretty closely the question of nuclear power, right? Which is science fiction. All right. But without getting into all that, you're actually. So I'm pretty skeptical about the notion that chance is adequate to explain what's going on. The counterpoint there is that skepticism is founded in a kind of vanity, or if not a vanity, simply maybe a fear of encountering just how incredibly arbitrary the cosmos actually is. And if that's the case, then, well, what do you do with it? Then you have, like you said, the sort of Nietzschean decision. It's like, well, all right, this is it. It's just, atoms in the void. So what are we going to do with that? And then, you get this idea that, well, we have to play this hand that we're dealt. And human responsibility, either way, emerges as is inevitable. Even if you want to be a mystic and say that the universe ultimately reveals itself as orderly, your access to that revelation ultimately still is predicated upon an exertion of some sort of responsibility. Right. So, getting back for a second, then to where the saucers landed.
After the saucers landed,
After the saucers landed, and the question of human responsibility. Here's the danger of the Pleiadian seduction, right? It offers a way out of this responsibility. And is this really ultimately what grounds the call to the FBI?
Well, for that character, he has decided the only thing that his responsibility ultimately is to his wife. And so the whole thing is translated, his quest to kind of protect humanity has been boiled down to, in a typical way for a genre novel, to his responsibility for his wife. And what happens is that the aliens, she's already surrendered to the saucer people by the time he is after protecting her, when he goes to the FBI, and she is there, and sort of only she's not, she's a pod person of the alien or whatever. And so his reason, it's the thing that's outside of his own desire the thing that he's trying to, that's supposed to authenticate his responsibility, is taken away from him by the aliens. They say, yeah, you want to protect your wife? Well, here she is. There she goes. Now what are you going to do? Who are you anyway? I think it's time for you to surrender, is how that encounter ends. So at the very end of the book, the question is whether or not he'll be surrendering or not, and what that surrender will look like, and what he'll surrender to. And it was a book that I wrote rather quickly, and that ending was the most difficult part, is trying to figure out not to just end on a negative note, not just to have him surrender and, have this dystopian moment where I can't resolve the problem, but without inauthentically spelling out a solution that didn't really work. And so I'd be interested to know when you get to the end of the book what you think of the solution. But now I finished with that thought.
So I think that that's an important part of human responsibility, is that it actually involves something like selflessness, right? So at the end of the day, it's just not enough to live for ourselves. And here, it's his responsibility to his wife, which in a way, by being willing to sort of like call the FBI and affirm that whole, edifice, right, indicates that he's actually willing to sort of damn himself in a way. He's willing to work with that sort of element of society to which he's nominally been opposed or indifferent, and in a way sacrifice part of himself to save his wife and bring her back from the Pleiadians and so forth. And that willingness to self-sacrifice is probably integral to sort of bringing meaning back into the vacuity of the universe.
Yeah.
Is that accurate? Or
I'm thinking about how that scene actually went, and
now I have to finish the book. Okay, so
I think perhaps my character is more morally ambiguous than I'd want him to be, because I don't think that in the end that sacrifice for his wife is what redeems him. He still has further to fall before there's a solution, and the solution doesn't. The real nasty bit is the solution doesn't redeem him.
Well, we'll just have to leave it there for the moment. Except
spoiler alert.
It's interesting to like interrogate the notion of the moral too, right? Because I've been thinking about that a lot lately. It seems like the irony is that to like really be moral, you have to release the idea of being moral, because as soon as you're acting in conformity to some sort of extrinsic imperative, it seems that you've negated your own freedom, and by negating your own freedom, you're actually negating your ability to be moral. But
you need to read the Phenomenology of Spirit, because there's a whole section on morality that's a critique of Kant that Hegel puts forward that is really, as they say, problematic and interesting. Hegel tends to demonstrate again and again in various ways that what we take to be morality is actually self-interest, and that true morality is recognizing this fact. But that makes him sound much more Nietzschean than he is. That's not a position of power to understand that. You aren't authenticated in your actions. You have the responsibility of both to act and to accept how your actions go wrong, and maybe respond to those errors. That's what I think Hegel would leave us with in terms of morality. But really, we should do like 2 or 3 podcasts just on a couple of chapters in the Phenomenology to make sure I'm squaring my circle correctly there.
Right. And actually, this is like the 3rd or 4th time that this book has come up randomly. in my personal existence here, I'm just going to have to run out after we're done here and just go grab a copy and get to it. Because actually Camus talks about it in The Rebel. He gives like a whole sort of gloss of the phenomenology of spirit as offering a particular interpretation of freedom and the political significance of freedom, which consummates in the spirit, my understanding is, with a kind of approbation of the state as the epitomization of history and the end point, which is a significant point of discord from then what happens with Marx and so forth. But anyway, we got to stop. We got to slow it down.
Yeah. We're almost done here, huh? How long have we been talking?
Not quite an hour. We've got like another few minutes left on the hour.
Yeah.
So, did you have any? Would you have any sort of like finishing thoughts or what happened?
Well, you know, I think this was a really good conversation, and I kind of imagine like what would someone who isn't a philosophy nerd but likes science fiction make of all this, and I would imagine some of them would be rather put off of the whole thing, you know. But you know, screw it. That's the truth is all these ideas are in the book. I mean, and then there are things I was really playing around with, but I was playing around with them. It's not. I wouldn't expect someone who's a philosopher to take it up and go, oh yeah, this is it's like I'm reading Hegel. It's not, but anyway.
Well, to respond to that, you've got this often posited disjunction between the fictional and the philosophical or the conceptual, as I believe to which you alluded at some point earlier in the conversation. But it's a dubious distinction because you're just looking at different modalities of engaging the same frame, and it's not just a question of something being an allegory. So I think that there's something deeper going on there than the merely allegorical. But you've got Umberto Eco in The Name of the Rose, though, by the way, which is an extended reflection on the questions of nominalism and realism as they are arbitrated in medieval philosophy. And you can read that book and be entertained just by the murder mystery without giving any thought to, Duns Scotus or Aquinas or what any of those chaps have to do with what's going on in The Name of the Rose. And by analogy, you can read After the Saucers Landed as just a fiction, just a story about people dealing with an unusual situation and the human implications of dealing with those situations without being concerned about the background of rationalism, empiricism, or German idealism, or any of that stuff.
Right.
So it's not either or; it's both and.
Right.
So,
but I will say that I probably am more confident in at least wrestling with the ideas in the book rather well. But I wouldn't want to compare myself to Umberto Eco, who's a writer. but I feel humble.
Well, yeah, they're very different stylistically, but you're doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Well, thank you.
For the book. And Doug is involved in all sorts of things. He's got a podcast. Diet.
No, it's Zero Squared. Zero Squared.
0 squared. 0 squared, yes. And then you have the other one, which ran for 5 years, which is still out there. I didn't know if you were.
I'm not doing that one anymore, but that it's still on the internet. But that stopped when I started being the publisher for Zero Books, and
right, which is the other thing that you're doing is doing Zero Books, which is zerobooks.net.
Yep.
And DouglasLain.net, LAIN. You've got this, and then you've got, as you said, some other stuff forthcoming.
Yeah.
So, please check out Doug. I'm gonna, and I'll go ahead and post all the relevant links when I upload this to YouTube, and I'll be sending you the link here when they get it back to me. Probably it's usually a pretty quick turnaround, so probably within the hour.
Okay, great.
So we'll wrap it up.
Yeah.
And thank you so much.
Hey, thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you. And people should listen to the Zero Squared podcast because you're going to be the guest on the next podcast.
Oh, well, thank you. I didn't know. I'll definitely share that as well. Out of my self-interest.
Yeah, there you go.
But the Zero Squared books, probably, it's worth checking out regardless, because I was actually humbled when I first encountered it at the quality of your guests and the quality of your conversations there. So,
all right.
And I'll post that link as well. All right, man. Well, I'll go ahead. We'll exit out.
Okay.
And talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks. Nice talking to you. Bye-bye.
Out.